This incident happened back in 2014 when I was last committed to a psych ward for a suicide attempt. A little background: I am female and was 19 at the time. I was coming off of 3 years of bipolar medication while at a peak of substance abuse facilitated by my first year in college going crazy with new adult freedom. One night I had a big mental episode and was committed for the first time in the adult ward. Previously, I had only been admitted in the minors ward during my adolescence for similar episodes. Within this unit, you had to share a room with the same sex but weren't given any proper introductions. The facility as a whole wasn't managed effectively, nor did any of the nurses or doctors seem to care other than to prescribe and get you out. I was lead to the room I was staying in, and the nurse just said to the other lady in the room, "This is your new roommate," and left. The woman appeared to be in her late 40s or early 50s, Hispanic and just a little taller than me. She would not keep her gaze off of the floor in front of her and didn't say a word or move when I said hi. I noticed she had a tattoo of a cartoon version of the classic Red Devil, but as a baby, I figured I'd just leave her alone and stick to my area of the room. The first night went as they normally do in a psych ward. My roommate declined to share anything yet again, only staring at the floor, barely moving an inch. While everyone was lining up to be given their medication before bed, the ward across began to start banging on the glass of the door and screaming. One guy was smiling while banging his bald head against the glass window part, while the guys behind him were screaming and jumping around. It seemed as if they were almost going to break through, but orderlies came and took them away with their screams still lingering through the halls. Being in psych wards before, I wasn't surprised by out-of-the-ordinary behavior like yelling or fights starting, but this was completely different to me. I was with disturbed adults now, people who had years of illness deteriorating their mind, not little angry kids anymore. I actually felt scared for the first time because of the high level of unpredictability with these people. I knew I wasn't all there in the head, but even these people had me anxious and made it difficult to try to get any rest that night. You know that feeling of being awake but you haven't opened your eyes yet? The moment where you are barely waking up and everything is fuzzy. This is the state of conscious I was in later that night. I felt as if something was waking me up, yet still tired, so I wasn't opening my eyes. The more I came to reality, I felt pressure on my forehead, and I could sense sweat dripping on my face. I opened my eyes to find the roommate standing over my bed, staring me in the eye with one hand on my forehead and the other in a balled-up fist on her chest, while she speaks in what I assume is tongues. I look into her eyes and they are blank and empty of any emotion. She keeps speaking faster and getting louder. I am paralyzed at this moment, not sure what to do or what she would even do if I were to yell or move. It was only us in the room, and the nurse's station is all the way at the end of the hall. She started wiping the sweat off my forehead while still speaking fast and erratic, and I wasn't sure what she was doing or planned on doing next. She then put both hands on my forehead, and at this point was screaming while shaking me, but not long before a nurse came in and took her off me. The nurse seemed more irritated that she had to get up and do her job, rather than concerning of how I was doing or feeling. She escorted the woman out and said to don't worry and just go back to sleep. I don't know how, but I managed to fall back asleep. I assume she got transferred to the more severe ward because I did not see her again the next day, and luckily, I was able to leave later that day. This incident has since been a reminder for me to never go back and to manage my mental well-being, because while I have issues, I could be in a far worse state of mind. I still wake up some nights with lingering anxiety and have to calm myself down to go back to sleep. About 2 years ago, I moved into a new apartment. The walls were very thin, and because of the fire safety laws in my city, my bedroom had one window, which led into the living room, and none with outside access. The window will be important later. It was 3 bedrooms, one for me, one for the master tenant, and one spare, which at the time was rented out by a pretty friendly guy. Well, friendly guy had issues with his work visa and had to move back to Canada last minute, leaving us about 2 weeks to find another roommate. Our quickest and easiest option was Craigslist. Due to my work schedule, I had no part in the selection process, but was content when the new roommate moved in a little later. He seemed a bit off, but friendly. He was a very tall, large guy, but pretty quiet, and not someone I wanted to go out of my way to hang with, but was okay to be around and be cordial with. About 2 weeks into his move-in, the master tenant left for Hawaii, leaving him and I alone in the home for the month-long duration of his stay. For the first few days, things are normal. All of a sudden, about 4 days into the trip, I am woken up at about 8 a.m. to a frantic knocking at my door. Roommate, we'll call him Kyle, is standing there when I open up, looking frazzled. He looks me dead in the eye and says, "So do you want to tell me what went on last night?" To which I was shocked and confused, because I had come home from work at about 9 p.m. and immediately showered and went to bed. I explained this to him, and he tells me that he heard me screaming and arguing with someone in my room, that he saw me in the side alley out the window, arguing with our landlord, whom I'd never even seen at that point, that he heard people coming in and out of our house. I tell him no way, none of that ever happened. After staring at me for a little longer, he leaves and doesn't bring it up again. The next morning I wake up to the same thing. This time he says he saw me arguing with my boyfriend. I was single at the time, had seen me talking with our other roommate, who's in Hawaii, and asking me for the badge number of the officer I'd spoken to, since he had apparently seen me talking to a bunch of police as well. This time I get angry and more or less tell him to cut this shit out, because I'm not doing anything and don't know what he's talking about. He gets a weird look on his face and says, "I think I had a seizure in my sleep. The next time it happens, call an ambulance," and leaves for a bit, only to start knocking again about an hour later, and when I open up, Kyle repeats the exact same story verbatim. This happens once more before I tell him to leave me alone and leave for work. I go to work as normal, and I am reluctant to return that night but am too tired to switch to an alternate location. Big mistake. About 1 a.m., I wake up to slamming doors. Kyle is pacing back and forth between his bedroom, the living room, and out the front door, walking in and out of each room, turning the lights on and off, mumbling angrily and slamming the doors. I can see his figure pacing back and forth through the frosted window in my room that leads to the living room. Since my room is dark, he cannot see inside. Suddenly he screams, "I can't live like this. Why are you doing this to me?" I think he's on the phone and don't respond. A few moments later he screams my name repeatedly and I realize he's directing it towards me. I knew I had to get the fuck out of there, so I very quietly creep out of bed and start getting dressed and packing a bag of clothes for work in the morning. I'm almost done when he screams, "I hear you," and charges over to my room, slapping the wall next to my door but not touching the door itself. I look towards my window and see his shadow lean all the way forward, pressing his ear against the glass. I was terrified and sat completely still, unmoving. He eventually screams my name again and moves away from the window, and I hear him start pacing between rooms again. Now my shoes are kept on a rack outside my door, and not inside my room, so I know that when I leave I'm going to need a moment to put them on. I decide to wait until his pacing takes him out the front door again, at which time I plan to grab my shoes, put them on and run. As I'm formulating this plan, the pacing stops. He screams, "Do you want to fucking fight about this? Come out right now and we'll fight, I swear to God." I'm very small, and this guy is easily 3 times my size, so I am definitely not looking to fight. After a few minutes, he turns off all the lights, and I hear the door to his room open and close, followed by silence. I wait for a moment to be sure I can't hear any movement, and then decide to take my chance. I took a breath and pulled my door open quickly. I step out and grab my shoes before I look up a second later and see him standing shirtless, with just a pair of boxers and socks on, in the dark of the hallway, his arms hung slightly outward in an awkward position. He says in a low, calm voice, "Ma'am, we need to talk." That was a hard no from me, so I grab my shoes and run out the door with them in hand. I run about a half block barefoot before I stop to put them on. When I look back, he is standing in the porch light of our front door, watching me run, but not moving. Luckily, I had a friend who lived 2 blocks away, and I had their spare key, so I let myself in and crashed there for the night. That's where I stayed for the next week or so while we worked things out with the master tenant, and Kyle agreed to move out within the week. He says he doesn't remember anything that happened, or wasn't sure if it was real or not, but if I said that's what went down, then it must be real. The day Kyle left, he sends me a photo of the house keys sitting on the table and says, "I'm out, nothing else." I take a friend over there with me to scout it and ensure that he has actually left. When we get there, we discover that not only had he left a ton of food and furniture, but he had ripped all of the fire alarms out of the ceilings. He had unscrewed and removed the deadbolt to the front door and left them lined up neatly on the front table. We then realized that my front door can only lock by using a key from the outside, and it had been locked when we arrived, meaning Kyle still had a key. We called a locksmith immediately. Even after changing the locks, I was still terrified to stay there alone afterwards, and never went to sleep at night without barricading the doors with chairs and other furniture. To this day, I still fear for his safety. He was obviously psychologically unstable, but also wonder what could have happened if I hadn't been as lucky as I was. When I was accepted into a college that was far from my hometown, I didn't really know anyone else who lived there. The college I went to didn't have dorms, but they did have apartments that they suggested students live in due to the proximity to the college. I was pretty broke at that point, plus I wanted to meet some new people right away, so I chose my apartment largely due to a roommate matching service they had. Basically, you fill out a questionnaire about your demographics and hobbies, and the service would match you with roommates that were compatible with you. Mind you, I chose this particular apartment despite the 1-star reviews I saw across the board online. I mean, they were under new management, and it was only a year lease. It couldn't be that bad. I was matched with another guy in a 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartment. I was so excited to move in and meet him. I moved in a few days after the lease started, probably about 3 weeks before school started, and already began regretting my decision. The apartment was shit and smelled like mold and old cigarettes. In fact, there was a used ashtray on the coffee table when I first got there. My new roommate didn't show up for about a week. When he did finally show up, I found out he was about 35 and didn't even go to my school. He was pretty scruffy and smelled like old cigarettes and BO. Eventually, I found out that he used to be homeless and took out student loans to afford the application fee and first few months' rent, but he never enrolled in classes. After the first few months, he stopped paying rent, and it took about 6 months for the property to finally evict him. While he lived in my apartment, he never changed his clothes. He always wore the same beat-up-looking camo pants and stained, dirty wife beater. I even offered him some clothes I was getting rid of that would have fit him fine. He was content though, so whatever. He would also have a lot of his old roommates from when he lived at homeless shelters over. It wouldn't be uncommon for me to come home to a random person doing laundry, even when my roommate wasn't home. When I would have a guy over to hang out in my room, he would watch us walk from the front door to my room through a crack in his door, just wide enough for me to see the creepiest look on his face. Literally every time. Needless to say, he gave me the creeps. A few months after school started, and after I was noticing his creepy behavior more and more, I was in my room asleep with a guy I was talking to at the time when I hear a knock on my bedroom door. I look to the clock and it's about 3 in the morning. I get up to go see what whoever it was wanted, and open my door to a random, dirty and old naked guy. He says he's a friend of my roommate and thought my roommate was in my room with me. I flipped the fuck out. Obviously my roommate isn't in my room with me. In order to get into my apartment, my roommate would have to let him in. And the apartment isn't very big, so it wasn't like my roommate could have gone somewhere else that his friend wouldn't know where he was. He was either in the living room or in his room. I throw this dude out and let myself into my roommate's room. This is the first time I've been in there, mainly because I have no reason to associate with him, and he's sitting in the corner doing absolutely nothing with his lights off, almost as if he was waiting for me to come in there. I ask him about everything that just happened, and he tries to play dumb like he didn't even know the guy. Someone had to let him in, and it wasn't me. I drop it, begrudgingly, because the eviction notices are piling up on his door. I figure it's just a matter of time until he's gone. In the meantime, I see the naked dude randomly in the apartment doing laundry a handful of times when I would get home from class. Finally, my roommate is evicted, and I think I'm done with that, and maybe we'll get another roommate that is actually my age or cool. A few weeks go by that are more or less quiet. Then one day I hear a knock at the front door during the day. When I answer it, I see the random naked dude standing there, thankfully clothed this time, with a trash bag full of what looked like disgusting laundry. He tells me that my roommate said it was cool if he came to use the washer, and starts to walk forward like he owns the place. I step in front of him and tell him that his friend doesn't live there anymore, and no, he can't use my washing machine. I close the door, lock it, and go back to my room. About 20 minutes later, I keep hearing a random noise from my balcony. I lived on the 3rd floor, so I figured it was just a squirrel or a bird out there scratching around. I keep hearing the noise, so I decide to investigate. and I see the homeless guy trying his best to climb up to my balcony. I told him I was calling the cops, but obviously by the time they get there, he's gone. That same day, I went to the property manager and asked what kind of roommate matching service works like that and demanded to get out of my lease. After some heated discussion, I persuaded her that it was probably in her best interest to just let me leave. I found a nice one-bedroom and never looked back. Years back, I made a late-night stop at a local Walmart on my way home from a friend's house. It was in a quiet area, not a lot of people out and about at nearly 1 a.m. I've lived around there for years and never run into any truly criminal elements there, so I felt safe going to the store alone as a woman in my early 20s. I made eye contact with a teenage girl the second I walked in the door. She was on a bench by the restrooms, hugging a backpack and small purse, checking her phone with a rather desperate expression on her face. When she looked at me, I could tell that she was on the verge of panicking. After a brief second of staring at me, she went back to checking her phone and making phone calls. At the other end of the bench was a white-haired man in jeans and a t-shirt. Altogether, nothing appeared off about him, but what struck me was the fact that he never looked up as I passed. Instead, his eyes were absolutely glued to the teenage girl next to him, not in a passive way, but like he was sizing her up for something. She was perched on the edge of the bench, angling herself away from his gaze and leaning away from him. Her body language screamed that she wanted nothing to do with him. Something about him set off warning bells in my head as I went about grabbing the items I had stopped for. I'm normally the type of person that mills about stores aimlessly, making a point to wander each aisle just to see what's for sale. That night, however, I felt a pressing need to get in and out of the store as quick as possible, and something in the back of my head told me to keep an eye on the man on the front bench. I moved my knife from my purse to the front pocket of my jeans where it would be easily accessible. That's how uneasy I felt being in the same building as this man. As I purchased my items, I watched the pair on the front bench. The man had moved halfway across the space between them and was trying to chat with the young woman. She was shaking her head and offering one-word answers, looking like a rabbit about to bolt. As I walked past them again to leave with my purchases, she stopped me and asked if I was headed anywhere close to my old hometown. Apparently, she'd been on her way home from a trip with friends, and they had made a stop to grab drinks and use the restroom. She'd gotten separated from the group and they left her at the store. The store was about a 30-minute drive from my old hometown, and I knew that to get home she'd have to walk several hours along unlit stretches of rural highway. The man sitting next to her continued to leer at her but refused to look my way. While I would normally have told the girl that I was headed the opposite direction, something in the back of my head told me not to leave her alone with the man. I agreed to take her home, and she thanked me profusely and offered gas money and a cigarette. I refused both and took her home, the logical part of my brain reasoning that the girl weighed maybe 100 pounds and was a full head shorter than I was, so if it came down to it, I could fight her off. The girl mentioned her address, and I knew exactly where she was talking about. It was an old, quiet neighborhood where I used to play Little League baseball down the street and swim in the pool a few blocks away. During the drive, she told me that she'd just moved to the area with her mom and younger sisters from a larger city several hours south. She'd taken off with a few of her old friends for the weekend, and her mom hadn't expected her back until the following day, so she'd silenced her phone for the night and hadn't picked up when the girl tried to call. We arrived at our destination, and the girl gave me a handshake and thanked me repeatedly, asking if there was anything she could do to repay me. I told her, "Yeah, do me a favor, get better friends." Looking back, I have no idea what about the man creeped me out so much, but something about him and the way he was staring at that girl got my hackles up. I had thought in passing that he might have been waiting for someone else in the store, perhaps someone using the nearby restroom, but upon checking out it struck me that I hadn't seen any other customers there, so he really had no reason to be waiting on that bench. I was still living with my parents at the time, so when I got home I woke my mom up and told her what happened. She hesitated, and I could see that she didn't like the idea of me giving a stranger a ride home, but in the end she agreed that something had prompted me to take action, and that I might have saved that young girl from being harassed, or worse. When my son was a baby, my mother-in-law would watch him for us while we worked. Because my shift started at 6 a.m., I would pack the baby up early to drive him to Emile House and turn around and go right to work. It was about 1.5 miles from Emile House, and I would travel the main road. One particular morning, I drove at approximately 5:15 a.m. to drop the baby off to my MIL. It was mid-October and the sun wasn't quite up yet. Near the side of the road on the opposite side, I noticed an older model black vehicle sitting with no driver or passenger. In retrospect, it stuck out because it wasn't quite parked at the side of the road, but it wasn't sticking out to block traffic either. It legit looked stranded. I dropped the baby off with MIL and left to go to work, using the same main road, passing the same area, seeing the same car. I slowed down because I suddenly noticed a man standing near the front bumper of the car. He was wearing a white button-down shirt, black pants, and was holding his hands up over his head. In one hand he was jingling a key ring with keys on it, in the other hand it looked to be a wallet. Being very young and altruistic, I instantly felt bad for this man because clearly he had broken down at the side of the road with no help. To put this in perspective, back then, not everyone had cell phones. Altruistic me slows down as I got closer, and the man's face brightened up, making me feel even better for thinking about being a good person for helping him. Again, clearly, he was a businessman who had broken down on the side of the road, likely late for work, and there I am to help, right? He approaches my car and says to me, "You've answered my prayers. Could you just take me about a mile up the road?" I said, "Sure, of course. Did your car break down?" He replied with, "Good thing that's not my car." Stupid me then quickly reasoned that it must be his wife's car, and he was just keeping his good humor with such a horrible morning. I motioned for him to get into my car, and I told him to put his seatbelt on. He buckles his seatbelt and I proceed to put the car in drive, and ask him if I'm dropping him off at work, or where was he going because I wanted to make small talk with my passenger. Within a moment of pulling away from his or not his car, he leans towards me and says, "So, do you want to know how many felonies I have?" My heart sunk for a quick second and I laughed, hoping he would be laughing with me. Silence. So I glanced over at him while still trying to drive and keep my composure, and he's staring at me with the deadpan stare and a smirk on his face. I instantly became panicked and angry, remembering all of the useless self-defense tips I'd learned, realizing that at this point in time, they would do me no good. I was in a vehicle with a stranger that I willingly let into my car. My hands got tight on the steering wheel, and before I could get another thought through my head, he said to me, "Why did you think that was my car on the side of the road? I'm not allowed to have a license, let alone a car, you dizzy little girl." And he was laughing the most horrid laugh I'd ever heard. To this day, I'll never forget it. I slammed the brakes on as soon as he called me dizzy little girl. There was barely any traffic, although I was hoping a car would have rear-ended me to signal police. From the pit of my soul, I screamed, "Get the fuck out of my car, you motherfucker, or I'll stab you." I didn't have a knife, and I don't know why I said what I said, but he unbuckled his seatbelt and dashed out of my car. I was so shaken and peeled off as fast as I could. I went straight to work and shared the morning's events with my coworkers. I could imagine the mess I was by the time I got to work. I was crying a lot. It was so horrific. After my shift, I went back the same road so I could pick the baby up from MIL house, and that car was still there in the same spot. I pulled into the gas station and asked the cashier if she knew who that black car belonged to, and she said she had no clue. It had been there the day before, but someone must have taken the white rag off of it or it blew away, because it was gone now. A white rag tied to a side view mirror or car door handle means there was a mechanical issue, and please don't give me a ticket signal. I don't know if this is a national trick for motorists, but that's what people do where I'm from. I couldn't tell the cashier what happened that morning due to pure embarrassment, so I went to pick my baby up from my ML house and went home. I didn't take that main road again for a very long time. I was living in upstate New York in a very rural area with my ex-boyfriend and his family. He and I used to argue quite a bit. One morning before he went to work, he and I got into a very heated argument. He was 20 years my senior, but during this particular fight he acted majorly juvenile. He jumped out of bed, flipped me the bird and yelled, "If you don't like it so much, then why don't you go back to the fucking Bronx?" That was all the prompting I needed. I threw on my Uggs and my winter jacket, grabbed my cigarettes and flew out of the house. I am unfortunately an impulsive ass and didn't think to grab my cell phone before I stormed out. I didn't drive, so my only option was to walk. I don't think at the time that I intended to walk back to the Bronx, as I was a 3-hour car ride upstate, but I just needed to go for an angry, dramatic walk. I realized once I got to this road at the entrance of the trailer park that I had no idea where anything really was around me, as I had only lived there a few months at that point, and we really didn't go out a lot. I banked left and just walked and walked where I knew civilization was. I found myself walking alongside a very busy stretch of road, with 18-wheelers flying by, spraying me with slushy snow and soaking my shoes. I saw my then-boyfriend driving by on his way to work, and he sped up as he drove past me, evidently still angry about our fight. I thought for sure he was going to turn around at some point, but he never came back. I pressed on, deciding instead to try to walk to my best friend's mother's house, which I knew to be in the same town. It started to snow and I was losing momentum. I passed by a VFW, where a nondescript pickup truck was parked in the driveway. It wasn't until I had passed it that I even realized the driver was in the front seat. He called out to me, "Hey honey, do you need help?" My stomach churned, realizing I would have to accept this stranger's offer. I approached his truck slowly and tried to weigh out my options. He was a clean-cut, seemingly normal older white guy, gray hair, greenish-blue eyes, just average. I blurted out, "Are you a good guy or a bad guy?" and cringed at myself for asking such a dumb question. He answered, "Ha, I'm a good guy. I wouldn't tell you if I was a bad guy." I ignored the bells going off in my head and got in the front seat with him. As we drove, I realized I had no clue where my friend's mom actually lived. I knew the name of the road she lived on, but it spanned a good distance, so it wasn't very helpful in terms of finding my destination. I asked to borrow his cell phone so I could try calling my best friend to ask her where I was going. I called her 3 times and she didn't answer because she didn't recognize the number. I started to feel inexplicably hopeless. After a few minutes, he asked me where I was from and why I was out in the middle of nowhere in the snow wearing pajamas. I explained I was originally from the Bronx and that I'd gotten into a fight with my boyfriend. He paused and said, "Hey, you wouldn't be interested in making a little money, would you?" I chuckled nervously and said, "Oh, no thanks though." He responded, "Well, I just figured since you said you were from the Bronx," and trailed off. Realizing at that point that I was almost definitely in deep shit, I muttered, "Oh, sure, sure." He eyed me up and down and laughed to himself before sneering, "Sure, sure, she says." I started to panic big time but knew I couldn't show my fear. I scoured the scenery for a pillowy snowbank that I could land in if I leapt out of the truck to no avail. The houses were so few and far in between, I became certain this would be how I met my demise. I'll never know why, but it was at this point that he decided to ask me who I was going to see. I quickly blurted out my best friend's mom's name and her husband's full name. He instantly perked up and explained that he knew the husband and how they used to snowmobile together 20 years ago. I felt the greatest wave of relief when he explained that he knew exactly where his old buddy lived. When we finally pulled up to that big yellow house, it was like arriving to the promised land. I sheepishly asked his name. "Steve," he said, then asked mine. I gave him a fake name, spat out a bullshit thank you, and ran as fast as I could from his truck to the porch. I crashed through the front door and locked it behind me. I immediately started crying and running through the house trying to find my friend's mom. I had awoken her from a sound sleep, but she didn't say a word about it upon seeing how shaken up I was. Once I knew I was safe with her, I explained everything, the fight, the fleeing, the weird guy and his sexual proposition, and she listened, horrified and curious at the same time. She made me promise to never do anything so reckless again, and that if I needed her to call her. She told me she would ask her husband when he got home about this Steve guy and find out more about him. I returned to my boyfriend's later that same day and got really stoned to try to forget about the events of that morning. The following day, my friend's mom called me to tell me that Steve was a dangerous person who her husband had cut off communication with years ago. The last he had heard about Steve was that he had been arrested for sexual assault. She then went on to point out how incredibly easy it would have been for him to hurt me and leave me just about anywhere on some lonely stretch of road, and no one would even know where to look for me. Not to mention, I might not have even been found until the snow thawed out. When I was a kid, I lived with my grandma in an apartment complex in a very poor area. It was a really rough neighborhood, but my granny and I were living in the nicer part, which really isn't saying much. The apartment complex was pretty small, with 3 floors and 12 apartments in total. However, due to the unfriendly neighborhood, the neighbors weren't exactly friendly either. We hardly knew anyone in the complex. People were constantly moving in and out before you even had a chance to say hello. But then again, the few people we did greet were either creepy or involved in criminal activities. I don't think we were missing out on anything. The complex had a massive basement, and each apartment had its own storage room down there. The basement also housed the laundry facilities. The entire basement had an eerie atmosphere. It was really quiet down there, and even the slightest sound could be heard clearly. Any noise in the complex would reverberate into the basement. Additionally, the heater, also located in the basement, made sounds like a dying cat, and every pipe and floorboard creaked as if they were intentionally designed to do so. As a young child, my granny didn't allow me to go down there on my own, not that I ever wanted to. Even before this particular incident, a lot of unsettling things had happened down there. People often used the basement rooms for illegal activities or to store suspicious items. Many people moved away without cleaning out their rooms, leaving their belongings to be discovered by the landlord. Once, the landlord found a meth lab, and another time, a batch of dead dogs was discovered, apparently alive when the room's resident lived in the complex but left to starve once he moved out. Anyway, I was 14 when I was first allowed to go down to the basement on my own. My grandma was getting older, and I was taking on more responsibilities at home. Doing the laundry was always a nightmare for me because it meant going down to the basement. However, as time passed and I got used to the sounds and creaks, the basement became a bit less eerie. When I turned 15, my grandma won a new dining table set in a raffle. Being the old-fashioned hoarder she was, she didn't want to part with her old set and insisted on keeping it in our basement room. And of course, the task fell on me. I carried a few chairs down into our basement and then into our room. That's when I first heard the noise. What caught my attention was that it sounded unlike any of the usual noises down there. It had a repetitive, pattern-like quality that was distinct from the random sounds I was accustomed to. The noise was particularly pronounced in our room but wasn't audible outside of it. It was as if someone were knocking on the walls in the room next to ours. I pressed my ears against the wall, trying to determine its source. I remember thinking it might be rats or other pests scurrying within the walls. Then the pattern became even more apparent. 3 short knocks, 3 long knocks, 3 short knocks. I had a sudden feeling that I had heard this pattern before, but I couldn't quite recall where. I went back upstairs to my grandma and inquired about it. She reminded me that it was the Morse code for SOS, which she had taught me a long time ago. I mentioned hearing it in the basement, and she accompanied me to investigate. Upon hearing it herself, she called the police. The police arrived along with the landlord. They had each resident open their basement rooms. For the residents who weren't home or unavailable, their rooms were forcibly opened using a ram. In one of the rooms, the police found a large old-fashioned closet, resembling the one from the first Narnia movie. Inside, they discovered a young woman who had been abused, starved, and subjected to torture. The room's occupant was an elderly man living in the apartment above ours. It turned out that the woman had been trapped there for at least 5 days. While many others had apparently heard the noise, no one else recognized it as the SOS distress signal. I'm attending a small private college in the Midwestern United States. As a fine arts major, I spend many late nights in the art building. On this particular evening, several students were there along with one of my professors. I was planning to take some creepy photographs for an assignment in the building's basement. I had been there before, and it was essentially a long concrete storage area. I wasn't scared, but I did manage to persuade my friend Beth to join me. The staircase led down to a narrow rectangular structure divided into several rooms. We turned on all the lights, revealing stacks of artwork and old documents piled in every corner and crevice, with cobwebs draped over everything. At one point, we had to leave to help another student who was moving pottery. When we returned, the stairwell light was on, but the entire basement was pitch black. I was certain we had left all the lights on. I asked Beth, but she just mumbled a quiet, "I don't know." I assumed I had forgotten to leave them on. We were in a room about 40 feet long, positioned on the side farthest from the stairwell. Our only source of light was coming from a room on the far right. The white light spilled across the graffiti-covered wall I was planning to photograph. The back of the room featured a massive heating-cooling duct system that covered almost the entire wall, jutting about 5 feet into the room. Stacks of cardboard boxes and tools cluttered the area around it. To pass the time, I engaged in conversation. I half expected some grotesque art project gone wrong to leap out of the shadows. Around 20 minutes passed, and then we heard a faint sound coming from the stairwell. It sounded distant. I asked Beth if she had heard it, and she nodded. It resembled the sound of hands clapping together. but we were definitely the only two people down there. Despite the unease, I continued talking. Then we heard another sound. All conversation ceased. It sounded like someone dragging an object across the hard floor, similar to the sound of cardboard scraping against concrete. I stood up. The sound came from within the room, near the stairs. I wondered if it was an animal, but how could it have gotten down here? There was only one entrance. My eyes darted from side to side, scanning the darkness. Suddenly, without any warning, a small cardboard box shot out from behind the far end of the duct machine. It slid across the floor, and my stomach plummeted. It didn't roll as if it had fallen. It was propelled, pushed, or kicked with force. It emerged like a projectile. Something else was down there with us. I gripped Beth's arm and she stared at the box, her eyes wide with terror. Nobody else could have entered without us noticing. My logical brain screamed that fact, but what in the world had moved that damn box? My thoughts raced as I positioned myself with my back towards the only lit room. The light somehow felt safer. Do you want to leave? I heard Beth whisper. Was she serious? If you want to go, I'll go too. Although I appreciated her politeness, we couldn't just leave. The box was blocking the opposite door, our only escape route to the staircase and a light switch. There was no way I was going to walk past whatever had kicked it out there. I remained silent. I wasn't sure I could even speak. During that tense moment, we heard faint sounds from behind the large machine, like an impatient hand drumming on a metal desk. But soon it escalated to banging. The noise was so loud that it echoed and reverberated in the confined space. We had no idea what was happening or what to do. The constant noise enveloped us, yet we couldn't perceive anything in the darkness. It was incredibly frustrating, but somehow I found my voice. "Who the hell are you?" I managed to choke out. My attempt at intimidation was far from successful. "You better knock it the fuck off." My hands trembled. Then suddenly the noise changed, morphing into one of the most unsettling sounds I've ever heard. It wasn't just the sound itself that was disturbing. The ghastly screeching and scratching reverberated across the room. It was like nails on a chalkboard, and I recognized it. Fear seized me. Something sizable was crawling behind that cursed machine, and it was moving in our direction, rapidly. The noise was horrifying, akin to dragging a concrete block against a cheese grater, amplified 1,000-fold. Whatever it was, it struggled against the machine, scraping against the wall. It was as if a disfigured person was scrambling towards us, and it was closing in at a frightening speed. That was the most unnerving part. It moved with desperate urgency, pressing against the machine and scraping the wall. It sounded as though a tight fit was involved. We couldn't see anything. In my mind, I pictured a repulsive and grotesque figure inching towards us. Maybe they had hideous teeth, 5 legs, and a knife. Perhaps they had been lurking there for a while, and we had unwittingly disrupted their hiding place. The basement was rarely frequented, and routine checks were unheard of. Conceivably, someone could have been hiding there. Either way, I was certain they intended to attack. Nothing moves that quickly just to say hello. Adrenaline coursed through me, and Beth appeared ready to collapse from fear. I scanned the room for a weapon and spotted a grim-looking plunger. It might not have been the most elegant choice, but it was better than nothing. From the other end of the room, another noise echoed. It was unmistakably a cell phone striking the concrete floor. However, it wasn't either of ours. Instantly, my fear transformed into anger. A switch flipped within me. I knew who it was. My best friend, Carrie. "Carrie, you bitch. You dropped your fucking phone. Get out here so I can kick your ass." I was fuming. Adrenaline and anger weren't a great mix, especially not in this situation. I began to move, and just as I did, whoever had been lurking behind the machine leaped out right behind Beth and me. It was a short, stout figure, and their face eerily resembled a bleached pig, complete with beady red eyes. I quickly realized it was a disturbing mask. The person immediately sprinted towards us, and I stumbled backward, gasping. My fist was clenched, and I was poised to strike when I heard stifled laughter. Of all people, my professor emerged from among the boxes. I distinctly remember blurting out, "What the fuck?" I was utterly flabbergasted. Carrie sheepishly emerged from behind the machine, clutching her less-than-stellar phone. The masked sprinter was revealed to be another student. These idiots had spontaneously decided to prank us. Unfortunately, they succeeded. The pottery student and even the janitor were in on it, instructed to distract us while the others slipped downstairs. They turned off the lights. and I had passed their hiding spots multiple times. We were down there with them for nearly 10 minutes thinking we were alone. Naturally, I demanded that they get the fuck out so I could finish my assignment. While I wasn't thrilled to see my friends, I was relieved it wasn't the alternative I had imagined. This happened when I was 5 or 6. My mom and dad were at work, so my 8-year-old brother and sister were watching me. We would always go down to the basement to play because it was really creepy, and they enjoyed it, even though I despised it due to its eerie nature. Every time I would go down there, I would always stay with my older siblings because, in my eyes, they were so cool and awesome. Anyway, we had finished playing and were ready to go upstairs to play the Rocket Power game on our GameCube when they ran ahead of me. The basement was always very dark and creepy. It was huge, and in the dead center were the stairs that led to the first floor. Right down the stairs was one of those small windows that showed the top of the grass. Well, my brother and sister ran ahead of me and locked the door before I could get out. As soon as it was shut, I could hear them laughing and saying things like, "Ha ha, we got you," and "You're trapped down there forever with all the ghosts that like to eat little kids." They found it hilarious, and because we were home alone, they could do this and not worry about getting in trouble. Anyway, as I'm banging on the door, sobbing, begging them to let me out, I look back and see a man crouched down, just staring at me from outside the window. His expression was completely blank. His eyes were wide and bloodshot. He had a ton of scars and cuts on his face, and he was incredibly thin with long black greasy hair. Thinking back, he was probably on meth. This only scared me more. I started screaming that there was a man at the window, but my brother and sister only laughed harder. We had one of those metal plates that you stick to the bottom of the door to keep your dog from scratching it. Well, my dog had scratched part of the metal down. As I'm banging on the door, I cut my knee open. I start screaming more, and then I turn back to see if the man was still there. He was. He looked at me, then at my profusely bleeding knee, then back at me, and then he just started laughing insanely. It was probably the sickest laugh I had ever heard, and once he opened his mouth I could see he barely had any teeth whatsoever. His laugh was so sickening, it sent chills down my spine. I don't think there's even a way possible to explain this man's sound. I started screaming louder for them to go lock the door, but they only laughed louder. I could hear his laugh over my own screaming and my brother and sister. Eventually they opened the door, saw that I was bleeding, and pulled the old "Don't tell Dad," which we later had to. I lay down on the ground right outside the basement door. The window was still visible. The man watched for a second longer, with the same apathetic, cold, lifeless stare as before, then stood up and literally skipped away. I never saw him again, nor were there any reports in our neighborhood. I tried telling my family about this, but no one believed me. Though I did get something cool out of it. My knee ended up scarring, and often when I meet new people, they ask where it came from. I always get the pleasure of saying, "Well, you see, I used to be an adventurer, but then I took an arrow in the knee." It's a great way to get girls, and plus, battle scars are hot. I'm from Connecticut. I was in a long-distance relationship with a girl from Georgia and would often make road trips down to visit her. I don't really mind. I love road trips. I've driven across the United States and back, all on my own. There's just something about traveling the highways of the US by yourself that's just so freeing. To save money, I would sleep in my car. It's not so bad. It's basically camping in a metal tent. Makes you feel like you're really roughing it. I just recline the seat back, keep the key in the ignition just in case, and doze off. I don't put anything up to block the windows for privacy. Maybe I should have. The trip down south is a comfortable 2-day drive. My stop would usually be somewhere along the Virginia-North Carolina border. So for my previous trip, that's exactly where I stopped that night. Rest stops were often less trafficked and thus quieter than truck stops. Normally I would have stopped at a Love's, but I was so tired that I settled for the first rest stop I saw. It was oddly vacant that night, with only a couple lone cars sitting forlorn under the amber street lamps. Most likely travelers with the same idea as myself. I pulled into a parking spot away from the others, under the shadow of a tree and far from the street lamps. I figured I would have more privacy there as opposed to being bathed in light. So I did my usual thing, locked my doors, opened the window just a hair for ventilation, kept my key in, reclined the seat, and went to sleep. I was never interrupted on any of these car camping nights, so I never suspected anything on this one. Then a sharp tap woke me up. At first I thought I had heard it in my dream. I opened my eyes, a bit confused. Since I was leaned back, I was facing the ceiling and couldn't see anything. I hear another tap, like a tiny object hitting a hard surface. It came in an irregular rhythm. Was it raining? Was water dripping onto my windshield? I'm under a tree. Maybe something fell from the branches. Maybe a squirrel or a bird has dropped something. What if a squirrel was climbing around my car? Or what if it wasn't an animal? The thought occurred to me that it might very well be a person poking around outside. What did they want? Were the doors locked? Yes. The keys were in the ignition. I can leave in an instant. Still, I lay there, completely still, pretending to be asleep. Pretending I hadn't heard anything. Hoping whoever it was, they would leave me alone. It was better to not find out. I was too afraid to find out. It was better to stay here in blissful ignorance. Still, the tapping continued. I had to do something. There was no way I was just going to stay there. I had to look. My heart was pounding. In that moment, it was deafeningly loud. Whoever was out there could probably hear it. I decided I was going to look. I was going to raise my head up and see what was making the noise. So that's what I did. What met my eyes sent a jolt through entire body. The faint glow of the street lamps cast just enough light for me to make out what I was looking at. There in the windshield, staring directly at me, was a face. Someone, I presumed to be a woman, was lying on my hood, her face pressed right up against my windshield. Her face was completely still, locked in a permanent grin. I froze in overwhelming terror. The eyes I stared into appeared to have rolled back, showing only the whites. The nose was turned up, pressed painfully into the glass. The lips stretched wide, revealing horrid rotten teeth. Even in the darkness, I could tell her skin was sickly pale, contrasting her long, filthy black hair. Whoever this was, she was clearly not in her right mind. I don't know how long I sat there, too afraid to move. Finally, I got a grip on myself and shot my hand to the ignition. It turned over, making in that instant the most beautiful sound I ever heard. I reversed as fast as I could, trying not to give this creeper time to try anything. In my panic, I remember activating the windshield wipers in a futile attempt to get her off. I thought, was I about to drive out of here with some wacko holding onto my hood? Thankfully, I didn't have to worry about that, because as soon as I stopped, the woman leapt off, landing on all fours. Seeing my opportunity, I shifted into drive and gunned it, right as I saw her reaching for the driver's side door. With my foot on the gas, I sped out of the parking lot. Behind me, I heard her let out a piercing shriek like that of an animal. I looked in my rearview mirror, and for a split second I thought I saw her chasing me, running on all fours, her black hair swinging wildly around her. I couldn't get a good look, as I rounded a curve in the road leading out of the rest stop and merged with the highway. There I picked up speed and drove through the night. I did not dare stop again until I saw the morning light. I was about 8, and my mother, my little sister, and I were taking a road trip across Wyoming. This wasn't unusual, as we had family living all across the state, and my mom loved piling us in the car and driving. My memory of this event is patchy, and I remember it more for the way my mom reacted than for the event itself. I don't remember exactly where this was or where we were headed, but anyone who has ever driven through Wyoming knows that the roads are mostly deserted. We had been driving several hours behind an older green and white truck. We were approaching a gas station, and I remember my little sister being so excited because she wanted to get those little bottles made of wax that had juice in them. The green and white truck pulls into the gas station and we follow. We use the restroom, get some snacks, my mom fills up with gas, and we get back into the car and back on the road. A little time passes, and my mom asks, "Is that truck behind us the same one that we followed into the gas station?" I turn in my seat and confirm that it is the same truck. I sit back down and continue gorging myself on snacks, but I sense that my mom is uneasy. She keeps looking in her rearview mirror and watching the truck. It was a long drive to the next gas station, and along the way, the truck behind us would speed up and get dangerously close to us, and then back away a little. After a stretch of several miles, we were nearing another gas station. My mom adjusts her mirror so she can see us in the back seat. She says, "I'm going to pull into this gas station and open my door like I am getting out. I don't want you two to open your doors. Don't get out, just sit tight and hang on." I thought it was strange, but the look in her eyes scared me a little. My mom is a calm person, but she has this presence about her that makes you aware that she isn't to be messed with. All my friends throughout the years have been a little scared of her, which is odd considering she is just over 5 feet tall and about 100 pounds. Anyway, we pull into the station and up to a pump. My mom adjusts her mirror to see behind us and opens her door with the car still running. The green and white truck pulls in and parks just to the side of the turn-in. The driver pops his hood, gets out, comes around to the front of his truck and props his hood up. He starts messing around under the hood with his back to us. From what I remember of him, he was a really big guy, but who isn't to an 8-year-old girl? My mom slams her door and peels out of the gas station. I turn in my seat to watch the man. He turns around like he was startled, looks right at us, quickly closes his hood, even though he has only been looking in there for a few seconds. At this point, my mom is driving so fast that I lose sight of him. I was terrified, and I knew it must be serious for my mom to drive like this. Up ahead, the road bent sharply to the left, and there was a small road to the right with a few buildings. Just before the bend, my mom slams on the brakes, pulls the steering wheel all the way to the right, and as if it were straight out of an action movie, slides around the corner. She speeds through the small parking lot of one of the buildings and parks behind it. From our vantage point, we were hidden from traffic behind us, but could see anyone passing. A short time later, we watched the green and white truck speed right past us and around the bend in the road. Obviously, my sister and I were very shaken up. My mom asks if we needed to use the restroom, and I said yes. She said she did too, but we would wait here for a bit, then make our way to the next station. I'll never forget what she said next, because it was so out of character for her. She said, "I'd rather piss my pants in this car than be murdered on the side of this road." A little time passes, we got back on the road and continued on our trip. We never saw that truck again. This past September, I had taken a road trip down to Myrtle Beach with my family. It was myself, my mother, my sister, her husband, and their 2 kids. We had used my car and both my sister and husband's car to transport everything and all of us. We had rented a beach house for a little over a week, had a pretty great time. I was in the middle of a difficult point in my life and struggling with employment and being in between jobs, and having just started 2 new jobs fresh. I was a little low on funds and worried about making my car payments and the like, so I opted to head home 2 days early with my car so I could try and get more hours at work. My family expressed being nervous as I planned to leave after dinner and drive through the night to get home. I consoled them that I'd be okay to be up all night and I'd head straight home and only stop for gas and food as needed. I'm an excellent driver, a tad impatient, so I tend to go until I absolutely had to stop and take a break. However, this would be a 12-hour trip and I knew I would need breaks, so I made a point to stop at every rest stop to at least get out and stretch, so I stayed awake and didn't get too sore. Going through West Virginia, I'm sure you guys know how secluded their rest stops and visitor centers and the like are, especially when you're heading north from the south, going through the mountains. I stopped at a visitor center because they advertised having a fast food joint, and I had to piss like a racehorse. This was sometime very late at night, maybe 1 to 3 a.m. sometime. Side note that sent shivers down my spine after what happens. I like to drive barefoot. So I pulled in, noticed the buildings with fast food were closed, so I drove around the lot and parked under a streetlight in front of the visitor center so I could use the restroom. Leaning out of my car door, I took my time putting my shoes on to walk inside, having looked around and not seeing anything out of the ordinary. I checked my phone and grabbed my wallet before standing up to walk in, making sure my car horn beeped to signal my doors were locked. Walking towards the center, I saw a man in a white hoodie standing at the edge of the sidewalk leading into the center. I didn't think much of it, until I passed him and got an off vibe. I glanced over my shoulder and he was watching me walk in. For some reason, I glanced to my left as I turned back to face forward and noticed another man sitting at the benches that were on the other side of tall, thin bushes. Instantly, I thought, nope. I went in and peed, and before I walked out of the bathroom, I called my roommate, as dumb as it was because he was a good 6 hours away. I just felt safer. I gave him a quick rundown of my situation and made him stay on the phone with me. I started to walk out, and I couldn't see the man at the front of the sidewalk anymore. I glanced to my now right and saw both men standing next to a bench. Facing forward, I saw a couple walking in to presumably use the restroom as well. I had an impulse to ask them to walk with me, but my paranoia kicked in because I knew something was wrong somewhere in my situation, and I didn't ask, thinking they might know the men. Walking briskly to my car, I explained to my roommate that the men were by the benches. Daring the smallest of peeks over my shoulder again, I saw the man in the white hoodie walking towards me, and I told my roommate. Walking a few more paces forward, I looked back again and saw his pace has quickened. At this point, I told my roommate he's following me to my car, and I booked it. I thankfully had a key fob, got my key out and ready, and unlocked my car and practically threw myself in. Not daring a glance back, I threw my car in reverse and gunned it backwards before going back into drive and sped off. I didn't even stop to put my seatbelt on till I was at the exit to leave the parking lot. I didn't look back once. I stopped at the next toll road and filed a report, and the workers called for state troopers to head over and check things out. I didn't stop shaking for hours, and I refused to get out of my car until I was home. I horrified myself at the thought of, if those guys had paid attention and made their move more quickly, they could have incapacitated me at my car while I was facing the ground and putting my shoes on, and I could have had absolutely no defense. It was a pretty average day. I met up with some friends, played a few games, and basically just screwed around. My girlfriend and I had made plans to go see a movie that night, which was the weekly norm for us. We are both avid moviegoers, so any chance to hang out and do what we loved was always fun. This particular night was the release of John Wick 3, and both of us were Keanu superfans. Suffice to say, we were really excited. I purchased the tickets in advance, in case the theater was full. We showed up, my girlfriend bought the snacks as usual, and we went into the theater. It was decently crowded, as expected on an opening night. We went and found seats in the back in case things became a little dull and we decided to enjoy each other's company, per se, but we were surprised to find a thin, sickly-looking man sitting further down the row. We didn't take notice of him for a while as he just seemed normal and tried to enjoy the movie. About halfway through, I needed to use the restroom. I excused myself and told my girlfriend I'd be back in a few minutes. As I walked down the stairs, I noticed on the opposite side of the room that he was making his way down the stairs as well. Again, this didn't strike me as odd. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, and just assumed he needed to use the restroom too or get popcorn or something. I went into the bathroom and did my business, but as I walked out, I noticed him waiting at the exit. As I passed, I heard him say, "Your friend is pretty, can I have her?" I did a double take and said, what?" He made eye contact and replied, "She is beautiful. How much do you want for her?" I very forcefully told him that she was not for sale and not property you could just offer someone to buy. I then told him to stay away from us, or I would call the police. He told me that he would wait near the exit in case I changed my mind. I returned back to my seat, but my girlfriend could immediately tell something was wrong based on the way I looked. I told her that the guy who sat near us earlier was just being creepy, but I didn't tell her what he said because I didn't want to upset her. The movie ended, and as we got up, I remembered what the creep had said about waiting near the exit. I asked one of the staff members if they had seen the guy wandering around based on my description, but they hadn't. My girlfriend then knew something was up, so I told her about what he had said. We both decided that it was best to just try and get to my car, so we made our way out of a side exit and made our way to the parking lot. About halfway to our car, I heard a voice yell, "Hey, wait up!" I glanced around and saw the same man running at us. He had something in his hand, but I couldn't make out what it was. I told my girlfriend to run, and we both sprinted for the car. I unlocked it, and we hopped in. The guy caught up and tried to force his way in, but by that time I had already locked the car. My girlfriend had already started dialing the police, and I started to back my way out of the parking lot. We drove for a minute before hearing police sirens. 2 squad cars pulled up. One went in the direction of the man as another officer stopped to talk with us more about the situation and what happened. The guy was eventually caught. He was holding a screwdriver and admitted to the officer that he planned on attacking me and my girlfriend. The night was a huge wake-up call to us both, and we saw that the world isn't all perfect. Back in high school, my friends and I would love to go to our local movie theater, situated inside our shopping mall. We usually traveled in big groups, but this time it was only my friend Alex and me. We picked a late-night showing of some obscure movie. I can't recall the name because this happened years ago, and arrived on time to find our seats. Since the showing was late and the movie wasn't a box office hit, the theater was empty. We situated ourselves in the middle, where we could get a perfect view of the screen. Strangely enough, a couple arrived late and decided to sit on our row, with only 2 seats between us and them. My friend and I exchanged confused looks and then shrugged it off, figuring it was solely because we had prime viewing seats. As the theater got dark, things got a little weird. The woman of the pair kept looking over at us every few minutes. The first few times, I figured she was just a nervous person and adjusting to her surroundings. Yet maybe an hour into the movie, she kept the pattern up. She wasn't even discreet with her staring because she'd turn her head completely towards us. I could see her entire face. I still see it in my head today. I nudged my friend and told him about the girl staring, and he whispered that he'd noticed too. At this point, I was feeling very anxious and almost wanted to leave the movie early. My friend didn't want to though, so I decided staying with him was safer than leaving alone. Throughout the movie, the girl continued to look over. Every now and then she'd whisper something to her counterpart, but he himself never looked over. Once the movie ended, I grabbed my friend by the arm and told him that we should get going because it's late. He followed suit as I sprinted out of the theater. Once we were out, the halls were empty because barely any films play towards the end of the night. I was about to say something to my friend about how the couple next to us freaked me out, but they ran out of the door seconds after us. I was freaking out on the inside, but decided to try my best to keep my composure. My friend was definitely aware of them closely following us out of the theater, but he isn't the type to be confrontational, so we just speed walked to my car. Once we got in the car, my intuition told me to just get out of the parking garage as fast as I could. I saw the weird couple make it to their blue car, which was on the same parking garage level as us. That wasn't surprising because the entrance to the mall is on that level, so everyone parks there. I sped out of the parking garage and drove towards the main street. I told him to keep a lookout and see if their blue car was following us. He looked back and said the coast was clear. I felt so relieved. Now we were the only ones on the main highway because it was late at night and we live in a quiet suburban area. Then a few minutes later, a car came speeding up from behind and flashed their high beams at me. My heart started to race. My head just told me it was them. I asked Alex if the car was blue, and he said he couldn't tell. The light to turn left onto the next main street was green, so I took the left turn necessary to get to my friend's neighborhood. The car backed off and turned on normal lights but still turned left too. I caught a glimpse of the car and started yelling once I realized that it was the weird couple's blue car. Alex told me to gun it, so I slammed on the gas and sped down the last main street before I had to turn into my friend's neighborhood. The blue car wasn't tailgating me, but was clearly following not too far behind. When the streets are empty, it's easy to follow someone since there aren't other cars to dodge. I turned into my friend's neighborhood but decided to drive past his street so that they wouldn't see where we were trying to go. The blue car followed us into the quiet neighborhood and was picking up speed to get closer to us. My friend Alex was panicking and asking what I was going to do. I just kept quiet as I sped down a random neighborhood street. I could see the car's lights behind me as I made a turn onto another street, but they were far enough so that they couldn't see me for about 30 seconds after I took the next turn. After I turned onto another unfamiliar street, I turned my car off and flipped it into neutral gear. My car is a manual, so I am very familiar with driving it, and knew I had enough momentum to roll into an empty parking spot, even though my car was off. I slipped into the spot on the curb and pushed the brakes to get to a stop before the blue car could clear the turn to get onto the street. I reclined my seat back completely and told Alex to lean all the way forward and not move. We sat there in the silence and dark car, my ears ringing from how quiet it was. My heartbeat was fluttering faster than it ever had before. I think it was a mix of fear and adrenaline. Within a few seconds, the blue car cleared the turn and started slowly driving down the street. It made its way past my car that was parked on the side of the street. Luckily for us, I drive a standard black Scion TC. There is nothing notable about the car. I haven't even changed the license plate frame, so they must have figured that the cars parked on the road belonged to the people that lived in the neighborhood. Alex and I literally stayed in our hiding positions for 10 minutes, just in case the weird couple decided to drive by again. Luckily, they never did. Once we got up, we just stared at each other and didn't know what to say. We were both freaked out and had no idea of what the couple had planned to do if they caught up to us. To this day, I still don't know what their intentions were. Maybe they're just a couple of deviants who enjoy freaking out young high school students? Or maybe they even had more sinister plans for us. All I know is that I don't go to the theater late at night anymore, unless I'm with a big group of friends. Back when I was in high school, my friends and I loved exploring creepy places. A few of us had our driver's licenses, so on weekend nights we would gather a group of 6 to 10 people and go on an adventure. One summer, our favorite place to go was this abandoned movie theater on the west end of town. This place had closed down probably about 3 years before we started visiting it, and in that time, it had become a rundown building. There were no trespassing signs on the front entrance, and each of the fire exits around the building, coming from the theater rooms. The glass at the main entrance was all broken and had been boarded up. The front door was busted and didn't latch or lock, so people were able to get inside. We knew there had to be homeless people crashing in there, but we were young and dumb, and felt invincible in a group. It was part of what made it scary. We would always wait until between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. to go into places like this, because we didn't want anyone to see or hear us and report us to the police. We all explored it together the first 2 times we went in. The screens and seats were all torn up inside each of the maybe 8 rooms. The bathroom mirrors were broken, and there was graffiti everywhere. We were fairly sure there were people hiding in there while we were inside, even if we never saw anyone the first 2 times we went. There were a couple of shopping carts from a nearby Fred Meyer inside with cans and bottles in them and a few dirty blankets scattered around in different rooms. It looked lived in. After getting to know the layout of the place the first couple of trips, we made a game of it for the 3rd and final visit. This time, the 6 of us that went split into 3 groups of 2, and with our partner, the 2 of us would enter the front together and spend a full 5 minutes inside while the others waited outside at our chosen exit in the back of the building. The first 2, Beck and Doug, both went in while we waited outside. About 7 minutes went by, and just as we were starting to worry that we should go in after them, they made it out the other side, through the fire exit. Doug told us that they went upstairs into the office, and there was a sleeping bag that hadn't been there on the last visit, and as soon as they went up and saw it, they tried to leave immediately, but they got turned around and tried to leave through the wrong exit, which was sealed shut. They were paranoid that they were being followed out, so they just stood there watching the way they entered the theater room for a minute, making sure that they didn't hear any noises before they finally worked up the nerve to run out the correct exit in the room across the hallway. Doug and Beck both wanted us all to leave, but Jack and I weren't having any of that and insisted on going in. Brad and Drew, the other group of 2 that was going to go in last, wanted to come with us, so the 4 of us went inside while Beck and Doug both waited by the exit. The first thing we all wanted to do when we got inside was to go check out the upstairs office. Just as we started to make our way up the stairs, we all heard a loud banging sound. It was coming from the back of the theater. We all agreed it had to be Beck and Doug trying to scare us so that we would come out and we could leave. We got upstairs and the pounding stopped. Doug was right. There was a sleeping bag rolled out on the ground with a few paper bags set up around it. Brad flashed a light in one of them and saw a syringe and something that looked like a vibrator. We were all pretty grossed out and had a little laugh about it. We looked around up there and didn't really notice anything else interesting, and we were starting back down the stairs when the pounding started again. We decided we should probably make our way to the exit. I hoped we hadn't been caught trespassing by the police. We came out through the exit, and immediately both Doug and Beck were talking over themselves to tell us that about a minute after we entered the theater, a really tall, creepy, homeless-looking man with greasy hair walked right past them, heading for the entrance. Beck said hello as he passed, and the guy stopped, turned, and kind of lunged a few inches toward him before stopping. One side of his face was really wrinkly. Beck thinks maybe he was a burn victim or something. The guy stared him down for a second, and then, without saying anything, turned and walked around the corner where we had gone inside. They started pounding on the door right after he was out of sight, to try and warn us there was a scary dude in there with us. We were in there for about 5 minutes with this guy, and we never saw him. He had to have heard us and hid somewhere. We started to walk back to our car in the Fred Meyer parking lot, about 100 yards away from the theater, and a car pulled into the parking lot and shined its headlights on us before flashing its red and blues. The police officer had us all sit down in front of the spotlight in front of his car and asked us what we were doing. We told him we were going to head inside the movie theater, but a really scary tall guy walked in, and we chickened out. He told us that it was really dangerous to go into places like this, as there had been violence in the building before, and it'd be a shame if we got hurt doing something stupid. He let us go, and as we drove off, we saw him shining a light inside the front entrance. We took the nice police officer's advice and never went into places like this again. I never did find out what violence he was talking about. It could have just been a tactic to scare us out of coming back. We stuck to graveyards and cemeteries after this. When I was 25, I made the biggest decision of my life, to move across the country to attend grad school. Life on the East Coast hadn't been great since I finished undergrad. I was working 2 dead-end jobs, in a toxic relationship, and feeling generally depressed after 4 amazing years of college. I meticulously planned the trip weeks before my departure. Opting for a route through the middle of the country, I would pass through states like Tennessee, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. Since I didn't have a specific deadline to arrive, I decided to drive 10 to 15 hours per day and find accommodations wherever I ended up. Instead of expensive hotel rooms, I opted for cheap Airbnb rentals. I actually prefer the homely feel of Airbnb over hotels. The first day of driving was the longest, lasting 14 hours until I reached Nashville. After checking into my rental, I enjoyed some barbecue and fell asleep while watching Breaking Bad. Early the next morning, I hit the road again. I can't stress enough how liberating it feels to drive cross-country. After driving for about 12 hours, I began feeling the stress of being behind the wheel for so long. I stopped for a coffee and to book my next stay. Although Oklahoma City, which was about an hour east, offered more options, I felt myself nodding off and decided to find something closer for safety. As I scrolled through the app, I came across an entire cabin for $60 a night. The caption read, "Bob's Mountain Getaway." The cabin itself appeared simple, with aluminum siding and a sheet metal roof. Luxury wasn't a priority since I only needed a place to sleep. However, something felt off as I read through the description. The poster seemed to be trying too hard to make it sound like a resort. The thought of those stories about people getting murdered in cabins in the woods crossed my mind. Perhaps I had seen too many documentaries and movies about killers, so I chose to drive to OKC and stay at a place that seemed safer. The rest of my trip went smoothly. I was in awe of the rocky and non-green landscape of the Western Mountains, which I had never seen before. Fast forward 2 years later, I had completed grad school, secured a good job, and was in a healthy relationship. I was listening to a true crime podcast called The Last Podcast on the Left. In one of their segments about strange happenings, they read a news story titled The Eunuch Makers. It involved 2 men who rented a cabin on an LGBTQ app similar to Airbnb and offered gender reassignment surgeries. These men weren't doctors or even college educated, and they were eventually caught when one of their patients ended up in the ER due to a botched surgery. Intrigued, I decided to Google the story and began scrolling down. Eventually, I came across a picture of the cabin. It looked oddly familiar, and it took me a moment to realize why. It was the same cabin I had seen on Airbnb 2 years earlier. I searched through my phone to confirm because I remembered taking a screenshot of it due to its creepy appearance. What made the situation even more terrifying was that these individuals were keeping the body parts from the surgeries in jars. They would grind them up to make sausages and other dishes. While I'm sure no harm would have come to me if I had stayed there, the thought of what was happening in the same place where I almost slept sent shivers down my spine. So take it from me, if you're ever unsure about an area, always prioritize your safety and spend the extra money. I am traveling around the country in my car. I have been driving for over a week from the city where I lived and have been sleeping in my car to save money. It wasn't until I reached a big enough city that I decided to treat myself to a comfortable bed. I chose Airbnb because it is cheaper than hotels. I booked an Airbnb the day before I arrived in the city, so there weren't many options left. I found an apartment on Airbnb that looked very new and modern, and it was in a great location. The price was decent for its location, and it almost seemed too good to be true. The only downside was that it was listed as a new listing with no reviews. However, I thought the low price was because it was a new listing and decided to give it a try. After all, it's Airbnb, so it must be legit, right? When I arrived at the apartment building, it looked older than I had expected. Later, I realized that my Airbnb was likely the only renovated apartment in the building, which seemed to be in poor condition. It looked more like a dorm hall than an apartment building. Nevertheless, I let it slide because I didn't pay too much, and the apartment itself looked like the pictures, so that was good enough. Everything went well for the first 2 days. As a female traveling alone, I always prioritize safety. I don't go out when it's dark, and I always lock the door, using every single lock, including the chain. On the 3rd day, I was out all morning and came back to the apartment to change before heading to the beach. Again, I locked the door, including the chain. I was in front of the door, watching TV while changing when suddenly the door unlocked and someone opened it. I was extremely lucky that I had put the chain lock on the door, otherwise it would have opened completely. I was naked, and no one else was supposed to have the keys. My immediate reaction was, "Excuse me?" and I quickly closed the door, locking it again. I came from the back of the door and didn't see who was opening it. I sat in front of the door, scared and shocked, realizing that this person could potentially still enter since they had the keys to the apartment. At first I thought maybe it was the owner returning after I checked out, but that wasn't possible as I wasn't supposed to check out until the following day, so it couldn't be the owner. After crying for a few minutes, I gathered myself and called the owner to explain what had happened. She assured me that no one else should have a set of keys other than her and me, and she was at work at the time, so it couldn't have been her. I was scared to stay in the apartment because someone could come in, but I didn't want to leave because all my valuables were there. It was a lose-lose situation. I decided to call my dad, who told me that it was not okay for someone else to have the keys and that the owner needed to address the situation immediately. He talked to her, and she assured me that she would come shortly with a locksmith to change the locks and give me a new set of keys. She then explained that she had only owned the apartment for 6 months, and that before my stay, there had been only one other Airbnb booking. She mentioned that the apartment had been sitting empty, except for those 2 bookings, because she had been renovating it, which now explained why the building looked run down and didn't match the apartment. She speculated that the only possibility for who could have had the keys was the previous owners or someone related to them, which seemed illegal. This possibility and theory really messed with my mind. How was it possible that I was gone all day, every day, and the moment I was home during the daytime someone tried to come in? Did they know I was there? What were they trying to do? If the apartment had been vacant for 6 months, maybe this happened frequently? Or maybe they saw me enter and attempted to do something to me. These questions constantly haunted my mind. I am just grateful that I had put the chain lock on the door. Otherwise, I don't even want to imagine what could have happened. Needless to say, I won't be leaving a positive review, and I won't be staying in an Airbnb with no reviews or one that seems too good to be true. I spent a year studying in Mexico recently, and as you do on exchange, I tried to travel as much as I could. Between the semesters, there is a big break, and my buddy, with whom I spent most of the time during the exchange, and I decided to go on a longer backpacking trip through Mexico together. We had a rough plan on where to go and what we wanted to see, but we hadn't even booked our flight back yet, nor were we sure from where we would take it from. We wanted to keep it flexible. We had an amazing time, and a few days before our trip ended, we finally decided to take our flight from a nearby city that had really cheap flights, but the city itself didn't really have much to offer. Then, on Airbnb, we found a room very close to the airport in a house with a pool, and we thought we'd treat ourselves to a relaxed pool day at the end of the trip. The host turned out to be a family, with the husband being Mexican and the wife being from Europe. She could even speak our native language, so we arranged that we would take a bus to the airport and they would pick us up from there. When we finally arrived in the city, it was already dark, and the bus driver refused to drive us to the airport since it was not directly on his route. He dropped us off on the highway, which was already a pretty shitty situation. We were standing with our backpacks on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere in a not-so-safe city in Mexico. However, I called the hosts, sent them our GPS location, and they said no problem, they would come and get us. So the husband came to pick us up, and it was a very uncomfortable situation getting into the car with a stranger at night in the middle of nowhere. It didn't help that the guy looked like Danny Trejo without a mustache. As I tried to make small talk with him, he only gave monosyllabic answers or straight out ignored me. I thought he just wasn't a big talker and hoped we would arrive soon. Looking back, I can see a million red flags, but at that time, we just didn't see them. Either we were too tired or, to be honest, we didn't really have any other choice but to go along anyway. We arrived, and that should have immediately set off alarms. We were in the middle of nowhere. There were fields with sheep and goats around, and suddenly a gravel road branched off from the paved road. Along that gravel road there were about 6 huge mansions, all with 2-meter walls, topped with NATO fence, huge gates, and at least 2 gigantic guard dogs per house. When we entered the house, we were greeted by the wife, a bubbly middle-aged woman who was very talkative but pleasant. She had actually cooked dinner for us, and we ate while exchanging small talk. The husband just sat at the table, not saying a single word. After dinner, we more or less went directly to bed because it had gotten late, and we were tired from a long day. The next morning, we saw that the weather was not that good, so we decided to go into town and see the few touristy things it had to offer instead of spending time at the pool. When we came back, it was already dark, but we decided to jump into the pool anyway to cool off because it was very hot and humid. The wife joined us, and at some point my friend made the mistake of asking how they were able to afford such a house. It didn't really match the price range of the jobs they were telling us they were doing. She deflected a bit and added that her husband was very handy because he had grown up on the streets and basically built the house himself. We realized it may not have been the best topic and broke off the conversation. That was the last day of our trip, and we had our flight back home early the next morning. We still had some weed left that we had bought on the trip, and we thought it would be nice to smoke one since it was our last night. But as this was a family home, and they had kids around, we thought it would be better to speak to our hosts if they would mind. Later in the evening, we asked the wife if it would be okay if we smoked on the terrace. She found it quite amusing and started laughing. She shouted to her husband, who was lying on the couch watching TV, "My love, the boys ask if it would be okay if they smoke some weed. What do you think?" He just laughed but didn't give an answer. We looked at her with a dumbfounded expression and she told us, "Sure, just go ahead." So we went to the terrace and started smoking our joint. Later they joined us and we just had a chat. And this is where things got really messed up. For some reason they started asking all sorts of questions about the weed, where we got it, how much it was, who we got it from, and how much we would have to pay for it back in Europe. They seemed way too interested in the weed, and at one point, the wife casually revealed to us, "Yes, we thought about doing that as a source of income, selling weed. But too many people die doing that because the cartels don't like it. Actually, my husband used to kill people for doing that." I immediately felt sober. Did she just say? And as if he read my mind, her husband added, "Yes, when I was about 16, I killed a lot of people for the cartel for money." He said it in a tone as if he just said he used to mow lawns when he was a teenager. I still thought I must have misunderstood, so I texted my friend, who was sitting across the table from me, trying not to make eye contact because I knew we would freak each other out. He confirmed that I had indeed understood correctly. We discussed what we should do and agreed that there was no immediate threat, and that we should just stay since we didn't have anywhere else to go, and it was already late. But things got even crazier. We tried to keep our composure and continue making conversation with our hosts. A few minutes later, though, the husband got up and went inside to get something. He came back with a literal kilo of weed pressed into a brick. He proceeded to break bits off the brick and roll them into a joint that would probably have knocked out Snoop Dogg. It was about the size of my thumb, and I guess it had about 2 grams of weed in there. Of course, he offered the joint to us, but we politely declined, saying that we were already pretty stoned. He seemed a little offended, but fortunately, he bought our excuse. However, it got even worse. A few minutes later, we heard a couple of loud bangs. The wife became uneasy and asked, "What was that?" He answered calmly, 9mm, confirming my suspicion that those were indeed shots. It was around 7 or something shots, fired pretty quickly after each other. The wife got nervous and asked if we should maybe go inside and questioned what they were shooting at. In the air, at cows, at people. He just shrugged it off, and we stayed outside. Again, a few minutes later, there were more shots, this time even closer. The wife became even more upset and asked again, "Should we maybe go inside? What do you think they are shooting at? Should we go inside?" And I think I will never forget when he answered in the calmest way imaginable, "No, everything's okay. I didn't hear any screams yet. I don't know why, but the way he calmly said that freaked me out, and it still makes my heart beat faster whenever I think about it. After that, we quickly excused ourselves and went to our room. When we finally could talk, we basically lost it and panicked. What the hell were we supposed to do? We were locked in a house with a contract killer in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and people were shooting outside. We decided it was probably our best bet to stay because we thought, well, we are his guests. He is not going to harm us, hopefully. And it's better to have walls, dogs, and a serial killer between us and people shooting around. So we barricaded ourselves in the room and didn't sleep a second until the morning when we noped the hell out of there and went to the airport. I have never been so happy to be patted down at security in my whole life. My name is Rick. I'm currently 32, but was only 26 at the time of this story. I grew up in Bloomington, Minnesota. I lived close to the Mall of America, so me and my friends would often end up there on the weekends if we had nothing better to do. It's nice for an indoor walking area because it's huge and circular, so you can still get exercise and people watch, even if there's bad weather, like in the infamously long, cold, and snowy Minnesota winters. On this day in particular, I was with two of my cousins and my girlfriend, now wife. We'd walked around the mall for a while and decided we'd go down to Barnes & Noble next. On the way to the bottom floor to aimlessly browse through some books, I started to get stomach cramps and figured I was going to need the bathroom very soon. Luckily, there's a bathroom in the back of Barnes & Noble, so I wouldn't have been holding my friends up in some random hallway. When we entered the store, I went straight for the back, walked hurriedly through the store and into the short back hallway, then entered the men's restroom. When I got inside, I saw that both the stalls were already taken and swore quietly to myself. I headed back out into the hallway to wait for one of these guys to finish up so I could have my turn, and I stood next to the drinking fountains trying not to visibly squirm too much from my stomach pains. I waited for what seemed like quite a long time and was quickly growing impatient and getting annoyed. Finally, I heard one of the toilets flush, and I didn't even wait to hear the guy finish washing his hands before I entered and claimed the stall he just exited. It was the back stall in the corner of the room, the larger handicap-friendly stall. I locked the door and started laying out some toilet paper on the seat cover, because I think public toilets are disgusting, and I finally sat down to do my business. I browsed my phone while I sat there, and time started to slip away. Embarrassingly enough, I'm slow to do my business, even when it feels urgent, so I was in there for a while. I started thinking about the guy in the other stall, and how he'd been in there for way longer than I had. He'd been in there since, I'm guessing, before I entered the store even, because he was in there when I first arrived to the fully occupied bathroom. As I sat there, my eyes wandered from my phone down to the floor, and I realized I could see part of this guy's shadow. The way the lights are in the bathroom, they were able to cast his shadow into my stall from under the floor gap. I realized he was moving around at least, so he clearly hadn't passed out or anything. Then I realized the movement was a very rhythmic and steady back and forth motion, and it looked like it was probably his forearm that was doing the moving. I realized that this dude was most likely being a disgusting creep in a public bathroom stall, instead of waiting until he got home to do such private activities. I started to text a group chat I'm in with a bunch of friends to tell them about how awkward this situation I'd discovered was. Shortly after that, I finished my business, exited my stall, and headed to the sink to wash my hands. While washing my hands, another guy came into the bathroom and promptly entered the stall I'd just left. When I finished washing, I stuck my hands under the blow dryer thing to dry them off. While drying my hands, out of curiosity, I glanced back at the creepy dude's stall. First, I noticed feet under the stall. They were in the same position, and his pants were still around his ankles. Then I caught something out of my peripheral vision and glanced upward toward the top of his stall. The dude was literally standing up, peeking over the wall at me, with bulging, wide-open, glaring eyes, just staring directly at my face. I couldn't see his full expression, since just his eyes and top of his head were visible over the stall wall. When I saw this, I quickly left the restroom and found my cousins and girlfriend ASAP to tell them about how disturbing what just happened to me was. I was laughing when I told them, mostly because I'm an awkward, nervous laugher, and even when things aren't funny, sometimes my body decides to make me laugh to ease the tension or something. They all were shocked and disturbed as well. I then decided I was going to find a manager or an employee and tell them that there was some creepy sex offender dude pleasuring himself in their bathroom. I spotted an employee and hurriedly walked towards them. They just happened to head towards the back corner of the store, to the children's book area, right next to the restrooms. As they got into the children's book area, they entered an employees-only door before I could get into comfortable talking distance, and I decided I'd find a different employee to tell, so I wouldn't have had to shout for this one who was probably going to take a break, or just getting off work. Then I heard a toilet flush. I immediately speed-walked back to my friends. When I reached them, I looked into the back bathroom hallway and saw a man round the corner. I identified him as the creep because of the shoes and pants he was wearing and what his hair looked like. I told them that was the guy, and they all looked at him while I looked away. I nonchalantly watched him through the corner of my eye as he walked for the front of the store, not getting in line to buy anything. As he got into the main walkway between all the aisles, he veered in an awkward manner around a clearance table full of items and walked directly towards us. This was extra creepy to me, because his shortest path to exit the store wouldn't have made him walk directly past us. He intentionally walked through our group and made us shuffle to the side. He walked past without doing anything, then exited the store. I avoided eye contact, so I'm not sure if he was staring at me or not. We all agreed that what just happened was extremely gross and disturbing, and I thought about telling an employee still. But it was a weekend and the store was very busy, and I was sort of embarrassed to explain what had happened to an employee in front of tons of random strangers. And the guy had already left, so there probably wasn't much that couldn't been done about it at that point anyways. We left Barnes & Noble, then walked around the mall a little more before we left. The next half hour or so, we couldn't stop thinking about how weird and gross that all was though, and I started wondering, if he was standing up to watch me wash and dry my hands at the sinks, couldn't he have also been watching me in my own bathroom stall that was sharing a wall with his? I really hope that wasn't the case, but I'm thinking there's a pretty good chance it was. He likely had seen me with my pants down while he was doing his special activity, and he may have even read my phone screen as I was texting my friends about him. Hopefully that guy got caught for something shortly after the run-in I had with him. If not, it's kind of scary to think he may have moved on to something worse. This happened a few years ago when I was an 18-year-old girl in high school. I worked at a store in the mall of my mid-sized Midwestern city, and that evening, I worked a closing shift. I was walking back to my car in the snowy darkness when a black SUV pulled up beside me. A woman opened the window and yelled, "Hey, excuse me, I need your help." She was a round-faced Hispanic woman in her 30s or 40s and spoke with a very heavy accent. I stopped and asked her what she needed. Yes, I know I wasn't too smart back then. She went into a story about how her sister got into a car accident, and the woman needed to get gas in her car before she could help the sister. However, she could not find a gas station and had no money, and she even said she had driven around to several churches to ask for help, but no one would help her. She was difficult to understand and did not tell the story super clearly, but I understood that she needed to find a gas station, and she needed me to pay for it. She told this story between sobs, and she seemed so desperate that I was moved to help her. I told her that she could follow my car to a gas station that was just across the highway, and that I would buy her some gas. I worked a lot back then and had a lot of money for an 18-year-old, so I was generous with this. At the gas station, I parked in front of the store, and was surprised when she did not pull up to a gas pump, as I had expected. I got out of my car and said, "Okay, don't you want me to buy and pump gas for you?" She then said something like I had misunderstood her first story. She didn't need gas. She needed money to give to her sister, and added a bunch of other facts I don't remember to continue the story. Her accent and changing story was difficult to understand. I said, "Well, I don't have cash on me, only my card. I mean, I suppose I could see if there's an ATM inside." She immediately replied that she knew there was, which definitely is suspicious in hindsight, but I didn't pick up on it at the time. I agreed to go in and get her some money from the ATM, and as I turned to go inside, she said, "Wait, but if you give me money, I will have to repay you somehow." I said, "No, that's okay, you don't have to." She said, "No, give me your phone number so I can contact you to meet up later so I can repay you, or give me your address and I will send the money to you." I refused both, and she tried again several more times, begging me to meet up with her later to give me the money. This probably lasted 5 minutes or so. Finally, as I refused a last time, she said in a very chilling way that I will never forget, "Don't be so nice." Despite all of this, I for some reason was still convinced she needed my help, and I went into the gas station to use the ATM. However, in my teenage wisdom, I could not remember my PIN number, and was unable to withdraw money. I went back outside to tell the woman, and she rolled her eyes, huffed something under her breath, and very quickly got into her car and sped off. I never saw her again after that. As I drove home, I became suspicious about the scenario. I figured out after a while that the woman was definitely just trying to scam me for money, but it disturbed me more that she tried so hard to get me to meet up with her later and give her contact information. I don't know what she was trying to do, but this has freaked me out ever since, and I wanted to share it here and see what other people think. The week leading up to the Christmas holiday, my family, consisting of one son, a daughter, my wife, and myself, took a last-minute trip to a small outlet mall-type place about 20 miles away from our home. We had 1 or 2 presents left to get, and we knew this place had what we needed. After 3+ hours of shopping, the whole family was beginning to complain about being hungry. The food court contained this little Italian place that had awesome spaghetti and lasagna, so we chose it. It came as no surprise that my son wanted chicken nuggets and fries. They made up a good 95% of his diet. Unfortunately, on this occasion, the Italian food wasn't that good. All 3 of us eating it thought it tasted a little funny, but because we were starving, most of it was eaten. My son, on the other hand, was pleased with his and had me wishing that I would have chosen Chick-fil-A too. Although we didn't like it, none of us felt bad or had any reason to believe anything was wrong with our food. No one said so at the time, at least. When everyone finished their meals, we headed home. The following morning, I was awakened around 4:15, with the worst cramps I've ever felt. I noticed my wife was already using our bathroom, so I had to use the one in the hall. The next hour was a living hell of vomiting and diarrhea on levels up to that point, unknown. In between explosions, I could hear the sounds of my wife suffering through the paper-thin walls. The idea that we had food poisoning first came up that morning. I was granted a brief reprieve from my sickness, just long enough to go check on my wife and get a drink of water. I also took some to her, but she couldn't keep it down long. Our son came into our room around now to tell us that our daughter was also very ill and had locked herself in the bathroom upstairs. His only concern was that he had nowhere to go pee. I told him to be considerate of others and stop being such a brat. If he needed to go so bad, he could go in the backyard. It was one of the few benefits of being a man. I was planning on saying something else, but the cramps started again, so I had to run back to the bathroom. The whole time I was stuck in that place, the only thing I could think of was, why didn't I go to Chick-fil-A instead? I'd thought about it, but I knew my girls wanted Italian, so we went there instead. I catch myself doing that a lot. It took some time, but I was able to purge myself of the poisoning. While my stomach remained on the sour side, the need to lock myself in the bathroom had passed. Once again, I checked on my wife and found her condition to still be terrible. I also knocked on the upstairs bathroom door. When I got no answer, I knocked again and still got nothing. Something told me that this didn't bode well, so I forced myself in and discovered my daughter unconscious on the floor next to a giant puddle of vomit. When I checked her pulse, I could barely feel anything. Trying not to panic, I ran down to my bedroom and grabbed my phone. I dialed 911 as fast as I could and told them my daughter and wife were very sick and that my daughter was unconscious. I'd completely forgotten about myself. They were my only concern. The 2 ambulances arrived quickly and rushed them both to the hospital. I scooped up my son and we followed in my car. This would be the first long day of many in the coming weeks, and not just for my family. My daughter's illness was found to be the worst, and landed her almost 3 weeks in the hospital, some of it in the ICU. While my wife's, though still being bad, passed within the week. I myself was forced to spend the night to take fluids, but compared to them, I got off easy. It would quickly come to light that we were not the only ones to become sick after eating at that place. The rumors spread like wildfire through the hospital that a massive salmonella outbreak had started. These rumors were confirmed a day later when the news reported on the full extent of the spread. At that point, 14 people had been infected. 2 of them, an older couple, passed away the same night we first spent in the hospital. The numbers would reach 36 infected over the 2 days the restaurant was allowed to stay open. The final death toll was reported to be 11, when the last victim, an 8-year-old girl who had been on life support for 2 weeks, was allowed to pass by the family. As the winter of 2018 became the spring of 2019, life eventually returned to normal, whatever normal is. My wonderful women had been back home for a couple of months, so we decided to have the Christmas we never got to have. All the presents we had purchased were still sitting in the spare bedroom. The week of Easter seemed appropriate. The rest of the family was invited over for food in which all the proper safety measures were practiced, by the way, and we exchanged presents with one another and had an all-around great time. I may be speaking for myself, but it was the best Christmas I'd celebrated in my life. It may go without saying that the little Italian place could never bounce back from all the bad press. They reopened soon after the problem was discovered, but no one would go back, and they soon closed for good. They'd already closed by the time we were able to go shopping at the mall again, and just getting up the courage to do that took a while. Of course, we wouldn't have eaten there anyway. I've learned my lesson. As of the 1st of September, when I'm writing this, we've only been back to the mall once since that nightmare of a meal. Even before stepping foot in the parking lot, eating anywhere in that food court was banned. My daughter has become a vegan since returning from the hospital, and I can't say I really blame her. I'd love to have the self-control to go that way myself, but I can't pretend to be something I'm not. These days, on the rare occasions we don't eat at home, 99% of the time, we go to Chick-fil-A, and we've never had a bad meal from there. This has proven to me that I was right to want to go there in the first place. At the time of this story, I was 14, and I had developed crippling anxiety and depression. All I'll say is that I was, and still am, very vigilant about my surroundings. On this day, I had planned to stay the night at a friend's house. I had never stayed at her place before. It was always mine. For you to understand this story, I need to explain the layout of this house. It was located on a sloped hill, and when you drove down a steep road, the first part of the house you would see was big and expansive, resembling an old mansion. If you continued driving down, you would be met with 2 semi-separated buildings. Both were small and run down. When I say small, I mean one of them was just a bedroom, and the other was a bedroom with a small bathroom and kitchen. There were no doors inside, just a piece of cloth or beads to separate the bathroom entrance from the kitchen. My friend's room was the bedroom, and her mom lived in the other section with the bathroom and kitchen. The landlord of the property lived in the main house, the big mansion. It was located in the middle of the woods, and when I say that, I don't mean it lightly. I mean all you could see was expansive Australian forest. Australian rainforests are incredibly dense, and if you tried to walk through, you would most likely receive some type of bite, whether that be a spider, ant, leech, etc. I'll cut to the first thing that happened. My friend and I had walked into her mom's flat and called out for her mom. She was in the bathroom, and as we walked past a small window, I heard, "Yeah?" coming from outside. I turned to my friend, and she looked at me the same way I was. We were so confused. If her mom was in the bathroom that was right in front of us, why did we hear a male voice coming from right outside? We brushed this off as not to scare ourselves and continued having fun in my friend's room. For a little more context, the landlord used half of her room as storage and blocked off the back section of the room with a tall shelf and a divider. There was a huge glass sliding door at the front of her room, and in the blocked-off back section, there was another door. You couldn't get to that door unless you squeezed through a section outside. Now, skipping forward a little to nighttime. My friend and I had to go to the bathroom, so we slinked out of her room and walked to her mom's flat. Her mom was fast asleep. We used the bathroom as quietly as possible, and then exited. As we were making the small walk back to my friend's room, we saw something out in the woods. A pair of eyes, looking directly at us from behind a tree. We panicked and froze. I pulled out my phone and took a photo before we sprinted back into her room, locking the glass door behind us and drawing the curtains. It's not a reach to say we were already freaking out. We looked at the photo, and sure enough, when I brightened the image, there was what looked to be a man staring at us from the dark woods. We were extremely scared, but I called my mother, who was about an hour away, and she dismissed us. After that, we were still scared, but it was a little comforting. After a while, we relaxed and chalked it up to our imagination playing tricks on us. We pulled out my laptop and put on a movie. I forget which movie, but it was some cheesy rom-com. Maybe 20 minutes into the movie, we froze and paused it. Footsteps. Footsteps crunching on the dry leaves right outside her room. We listened in horror as the footsteps moved through the tight alley that led to the back door. We both moved slowly, standing on the bed to look over the room divider. Our eyes were locked on the back door, and after a moment of complete silence, it turned. The doorknob wiggled slowly before it became faster. The door couldn't be opened as it was jammed against objects that were in storage. Then it stopped. No more noise. We were crying, holding each other in our arms, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Then the footsteps slowly crunched off the leaves in the opposite direction, back to the front of her room. We both didn't hesitate now, and I reached for my phone. We called the police, and after trying to explain the situation to the operator on the other end, in tears the whole time, she told us a unit was being dispatched and to stay where we were. Then, as we were still crying and hyperventilating, we heard a phone ringing. It sounded like an old landline phone, one with the harsh and loud beeping. It was coming from the landlord's mansion. We waited silently, listening to the drawn-out ringing of his phone. After what felt like at least 2 minutes, it stopped, and we heard his voice as he talked to the operator. At this time, we both noticed another thing. Fingerprints on her window. These windows were slatted glass that you could open up and shut with a lever. Whoever left these prints reached up, cupped their hand around the top of the glass, and dragged their fingers on the dust. It wasn't there before. Soon the landlord walked to her mother's unit and told her that the police called him. He seemed extremely upset and told her that he made sure they didn't send a unit. Her mother came to her room and we explained the situation. Both the landlord and her mother didn't seem too bothered by the fact that a man just tried to enter our room. I couldn't stay the night, and neither could my friend. We were too scared to spend another minute there. I called my mom, and she came to get us at about 12 p.m. We dropped my friend back the next day, and when we got there, her mother told us something that I don't think I can pass up as a coincidence. The night it happened, it was raining, and there was strong wind, but nothing strong enough to do this. Next to her mother's unit, she had a pole that held beads and fairy lights. During the night, right after me and her were picked up, it had been knocked down. Keep in mind, this pole was literally embedded into the cement and tied to other items with zip ties. There is no way that could have been the wind. That pole was sturdy. I still am unsure of an explanation for all of this. It may have been her landlord. I'm not too sure. It could have also been her ex-stepfather, who was pretty insane. Hello, my name is Alex, and here's my story. At the time, I was in my old bedroom, which was basically one of the smallest rooms in the house. I am now in a new bedroom, this one way more spacious. My bedroom was about 5 by 5 meters, and it could only fit a bed, 2 nightstands, and a dresser with a mirror screwed on top. It was in the basement. Now, most of you guys probably think a basement is dark, creepy, and eerie, but mine was not. My parents made sure to make it as full of life as possible. They painted the walls, installed a gaming room, which I used often, and basically made it really cool if someone in our family wanted to have a party there. Now, the room I think it was actually fair that I had that one room because before we moved houses, both of my brothers had to sleep in a tiny bedroom, about 5 square feet large, basically the worst, and I had the biggest room in the whole house. So at that time we had 3 cats. One died later on after what I had lived, but that's not really relevant to the story. One of the 3 was my favorite. I loved her and took care of her, and she made sure I wasn't depressed. Sometimes, we would just let her go outside during the night, and I would let her go in sometime when she scratched on my window. She still does it to this day. I was an insomniac, and I never slept well. My parents knew about it, so they decided to get some melatonin pills to help me sleep. My window was on the top of my bedroom's wall, which meant my cat didn't need to hop on any type of ledge or border to scratch with her paws on it from the outside, letting me know that she wanted to get in. It was a night that I decided to take some melatonin pills, which worked fantastically when I couldn't sleep. And so I was literally about to sleep, like I was on the edge of dreaming, and I heard my cat scratch, or so I thought. I sighed and got up to move my curtains out of the way so I could let her in, but when I opened my window, I heard something move or step on the rocks that were around my window. At that time, I was too sleepy to realize that it wasn't a cat's footsteps that I heard, but a human's. So, as a normal person, I yelled my cat's name and put my hand out of the window to tap on the ground, as such to let my cat know that she could come to get in. That was my mistake. In no time, I heard footsteps coming straight to the window, and I felt a man's hand grab my arm and start to pull me out of my window. I started screaming for someone to come and help me, but nobody came. I felt the adrenaline instantly rush to my body and quickly grabbed a sharp object. I believe it was a dirty knife covered in old food, and stabbed the guy's hand. Blood dripped out of it as I heard a blood-curdling scream, the scream I would remember my whole life. The man quickly ran away as fast as he could, and I fell back on my bed, opening my door and running as fast as I could upstairs to my parents' bedroom to tell them the horror story I just lived. They woke up fast and called the cops, reassuring me that I was safe and everything, caring for my horrible wound from the man's grip on my arm. They arrived at the house, and I told them what happened. I was still under adrenaline, my words not sounding very clear. With the man's blood that was on the knife, they managed to get his name and where he lived. They followed up on us and told us that he got arrested for attempted kidnapping, and that he already got charged with many other crimes before. I am still traumatized to this day. This happened a long time ago. I was a petite and small girl, only about 18 or 19 years old, and I worked at a junior food store in Kentucky. There were a couple of incidents that happened to me in the short time I worked there. I have several other stories, but those are for another time. The store was somewhat isolated, and I was left all alone for most of my shifts. My manager, who happened to be married, and another employee who happened to be my manager's best friend, would leave to meet with their boyfriends. Some of my duties consisted of sweeping the parking lot and measuring the gas after closing at midnight. I hated doing this by myself. There weren't any other businesses open anywhere close to me. This was back around 1984, so of course there were no cell phones. I was very naive at the time. One night I received a phone call from a man asking if we had any Playboy magazines. I informed him that yes, we do have Playboy and a few other magazines. He asked me who was the centerfold in the Playboy. The phone I was using was a cordless phone at the time. I politely told him to wait just a minute. I looked in the magazine and told him the name of the model. He then asked me if her private area looked juicy. I froze and hung up on him. Thank goodness he didn't call back. It scared me so bad, and I really felt like an idiot for even looking the centerfold up for him. The second incident was a lot scarier than the previous one. When I was hired, I had been instructed to call the police if anyone stayed out in the parking lot for more than 15 minutes. There weren't many people that came into the store after dark, and that night I was scared for my life. It was no different. I had completed my duties at the time, and I was just waiting until I could close the door and go home. A man pulled up right in front of the door in a light-colored car. I have never been able to distinguish the make and model of any car. I waited for him to come in, happy that someone would break the silence of my shift. I could see him as I stood by the cash register. He was leaning over, looking at himself in the rearview mirror. He continually wiped his face with his hands. I couldn't see anything on him from where I was standing. I immediately got a really bad feeling about what he was doing. When he had pulled up, I had glanced at the clock, and time crept by as I watched him wipe his face over and over. I waited 15 minutes and then called 911 and told the dispatcher about the situation. In no time, 2 police cars pulled up and confronted the man. I watched them handcuff him but didn't see anything else due to the fact another customer came in to buy some gas. It seemed like forever before one of the officers came in to thank me for calling them and to ask if I was okay. What he told me next made a shiver run through me, and my blood ran cold. He informed me that the man had been wiping blood off his face and there was a huge butcher-type knife with the handle broken off, and it was covered with blood as well. He said the man appeared intoxicated, and since his car was running, they arrested him for driving under the influence. The officer added that they had contacted his family and everyone appeared okay. He added that they didn't know whose blood it was, but they would continue to investigate to see if they could find someone that he had apparently hurt or killed. I never heard anything in regards to the case. I realized that anything could have happened to me that night, and I quit shortly afterwards. Back in 2018, I was 17 years old at the time, living in foster care. The group home was situated on a busy street. Despite being in the city, we had a backyard with a basketball court, picnic table, and some grass at the very back. The whole backyard was surrounded by 2-meter-tall chain-link fences. There were houses to the right and left of ours. At the very back of the yard, on the other side of the fence, there was a public walking and biking path that stretched at least a dozen kilometers. This path would take you through a huge park along the water, to the beach, etc. It's a very popular area for people to visit. I was a regular cannabis smoker, although I was always very well put together for a teenager. The group home workers agreed to turn a blind eye to me as long as I didn't make it obvious. So on weekend mornings, I'd go for a walk to the park behind the house. I'd roll up on a park bench and smoke. One day everything changed. It was a weekend morning as usual at 7 a.m. I made my way to my favorite park bench. I'm sitting there, with my joint in my hands. It was quite windy, and it kept going out. Facing the water, about 100 meters of field between the waterfront and I noticed a man stomping through the field heading straight for me. He didn't seem like he was on a leisurely walk at all. I remember thinking to myself, why is he not using the paved path? Why does it seem like he's walking straight towards me? What is he holding? Is anybody else around? Panic ensued. He was holding something chunky in one of his hands. I looked around for someone and noticed an elderly woman walking from the direction of the group home. She was about 20 meters away from me. I speed walked towards the woman. By the time I got to her, the man had made it to the bench I was sitting on. The woman kept walking towards the bench and I in the opposite direction. For a moment I looked back to make sure the man wasn't following me, or worse. I saw the man lay his brick down on a pile of rocks behind the bench. The woman stopped walking. I'm guessing she had processed something peculiar. Thankfully, the man kept moving straight towards the boulevard and was not seen in the park. The woman then turned around, and she looked at me with this shocked stare in her eyes. I remember feeling reassured. We both continued on with our days without saying a single word. Later that same day, around 9 p.m., people aren't allowed to smoke within 10 meters of an entry to an establishment, and there was only one light in the backyard, above the entry to the establishment. So this girl in my group home goes out for a smoke in the backyard. No lights. Like 3 minutes later, she's banging on the door yelling and I let her in. She's freaking out and we're trying to get answers out of her. Then she explains, there was a man. He stood there on the path. She watched and stared, taking pulls off her cigarette. The man then starts walking towards her and starts climbing the fence. That's when I shared my story from that same morning. To be honest, I thought I was being paranoid at first, but when someone tried to hop the fence, I believe it was the same man. The workers on shift that night called the police, and the police started patrolling the path at night. The group home added some garden lights in the back. I hope this piece of shit never lays hands on anyone. It was 2016, and I had just started a new job at a motel. It paid low wages, but I needed an office job. One of my friends, Michael, got me this job. For a few days, I underwent training with the owner in the mornings. For 2 nights, Michael trained me for the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. It was nothing exciting, checking guests in and doing paperwork. My boss, the owner, went away with his wife on vacation for a week, which explained the swift training I had to endure. So it was my first night alone on the night shift. There was a monitor with security cameras around the motel's property and large glass windows all around the office building, but there was no night window like most motels have. It was fairly early in the night, around 1 a.m., when a man walked in and asked if we had any rooms available. Usually, if someone seemed sketchy, my boss had me lie and say no, but he appeared normal at the moment. Without hesitation, I said, "Yes, of course. Just for one?" He replied affirmatively. So I began creating the reservation on the computer when I noticed he started swatting the air and making spitting noises, as if he was being surrounded by flies. I tried to ignore it. As far as I was concerned, it wasn't my business. So I tried to check him into the room as quickly as possible, gave him his key, and sent him on his way. At this point, I could be described as very timid. I had a lot going on in my personal life, so I hope you can all understand my reaction to what happened next. The man returned from his room and slammed his hand on the glass door, causing me to jump. Absolutely frightened, I looked up to see him just staring at me. He cracked the door and put his head through, saying, "I can't get into my room. Why won't you let me into my room?" My only defense was trying to be helpful, so I replied, "Maybe there's something wrong with your key. Let me give you another one." The look he had in his eyes was inexplicable, and I felt like I was in absolute danger. I handed him his new key, and he went back to his room. I tried texting Michael for help, but there was no reply. It was the middle of the night, and he was asleep. With no reply from Michael, I noticed the man trudging down the stairs to come back. I went into absolute panic mode, ran into the back office, locked the door, and pulled out my pocket knife. It's important to have protection when working at night. I heard the man in the office yelling, "Hello? Hello? Why won't you let me into my room? Do you not like me?" Being an absolute idiot and not standing my ground or calling the police when I was scared, I decided to take this situation on alone. I replied, "I'm just on the phone. I'll be right out." Then, I started calling Michael repeatedly for help, but there was no answer. I took a few deep breaths and then stepped out of the office. The man wasn't there. He was in the bathroom. I started hearing him talking to himself, angrily saying, "Kill her! Kill her!" My heart sank. Still being an idiot and not calling the police, he came out and I said, "Your key was broken, I'm sorry. Let me escort you to your room." Thankfully, he agreed. I was wearing a long-sleeved sweater, so with my arms down, I was able to hide my knife in my hand while holding it. I began to walk outside, and he seemed insistent on walking behind me. We started making our way to the staircase and up towards his room. I was sweating from how nervous I was, continuously looking behind me to ensure he wasn't going to make a move. He stopped at a room, and I stopped at his room a few doors down. I smiled and said, "Oh, that's the wrong room. This is your room," as it clearly said on the door. The whole time he was going to someone else's room and trying to open the door. I felt bad for them. I quickly ran back to the office, locked the door, and the next guest I checked in was a police officer from a few towns away. I felt bad for confiding in them about the guy, but they seemed willing to keep an eye and ear out. The next night, the man came back, but I had the doors locked and told him we were all booked up. I explained to my boss what happened when he got back from vacation. However, he didn't take me seriously. I continued to work there on the night shift for the next year, where many other strange encounters happened. I work in a fairly busy hospital downtown, in the NICU. I usually work at night, and I kid you not, this happened to me less than 5 minutes ago. I figured it would be a good idea to document this before I forget. It's also a way for me to have some sort of proof in case something comes of it. During orientation, we are taught to be observant for signs of a possible abductor. We were taught to look for oversized clothing, bags, and shifty behavior. Fortunately, I've never encountered a strange individual until just now. It's currently 2:59 a.m., and I've been sitting at the front desk since 11 p.m. I'm a nursing student, so I usually handle clerical work around the unit. I also monitor the cameras to ensure no one unauthorized is present. It's usually pretty quiet at night. However, I've already had a somewhat weird night, so this just adds a cherry on top of it. The NICU and most of the second floor is a secured unit. This means that in order to gain entrance, you have to pick up a phone that then rings at the desk. Usually it's parents wanting to see their babies or family members who are lost. It typically quiets down around 11 p.m., so no one usually comes in or out during my shift except for housekeeping. One of the security cameras is positioned so I can see who is picking up the first phone. I had been sitting here browsing Instagram when the phone rang. I glanced over at the phone, thinking it was a parent wanting an update or something of that sort. It took me a second to realize that it was the number for the first set of doors. I picked it up and looked over at the screen. There was a lady in baggy clothing with a sling on her arm. I answered the door, and she said she wanted to find her cousin, who had apparently been brought up from the emergency department. I asked for the last name, and she unintelligibly rambled off a Latino name that I only caught the first part of. Knowing that we did not have any new admissions, I told her we didn't have anyone by that name. I tried to get more information from her, and she again mentioned that her cousin had been brought up from the ED. In that case, I informed her that she should go to labor and delivery and speak to them. She hesitated, and then said okay, and walked away. I got a really weird feeling from her, so I checked the census to see if anyone was being assessed in L&D, and there wasn't. So either she was at the wrong hospital, or she wanted access to the unit for something more sinister than just seeing her cousin. I shrugged it off, thinking that if her cousin was in L&D, she would find her, and all would be well. About 5 minutes later, the same lady appeared in her extremely baggy clothing and her sling. The only difference was that this time, she was putting the sling on and using her injured hand to fumble with something in her oversized sweatshirt. She picked up the phone and once again requested entry to find her cousin, mentioning that L&D said they had no one by that name. I told her the exact same thing, insisting that she needed to contact her cousin and return to L&D. She became hostile for a moment, then hung up the phone. Whether or not she was trying to gain access to the unit for things that she shouldn't be doing, I'll never know. But creepy lady who looked like a baby snatcher, I hope we never meet again. I am a 6'7" male in Australia, and I'd like to think I'm a fairly tough and intimidating guy, but some of the stuff that used to go on at the mall I used to work the night shift for still gives me goosebumps to this day. So the mall I worked at was very, very large, probably the largest in my state, I'd say. Up until about 8:30 p.m., it would still be quite busy. Only around 9:30 p.m. would we manage to usher all of the stragglers out, and only at about 11 p.m. would all of the business owners have left. My job was basically to patrol the mall and make sure no one was sticking around after the doors were closed during the night. We didn't have guns or batons, only a can of mace that was very rarely used. There were multiple occasions where we would find would-be thieves hiding around trying to break into shops after dark, but they were normally far outnumbered by the 5 of us on shift at a time, and they would usually be intimidated by me or some of the other imposing members of security. This one night, though, things started getting really weird for me on the night shift. So I'd say it was about 2 o'clock, and I was standing in the middle of the empty food court, eating a sandwich. This was the only part of the mall that had any light at nighttime due to the skylight, so it was comfortable to eat there. While I was eating, though, I heard a dull scraping noise from the hallway leading off from the food courts into some toilets. It sounded like a piece of metal dragging across the floor. I was immediately put on edge, and I flicked on my flashlight without a moment of hesitation. I can remember creeping down the hallway, flashlight in hand, illuminating a good 6 or 7 meters in front of me. As I got closer and closer to the end of the hall, the noise became louder and louder until I was at the end of the hallway, and there were the toilet doors to the left and right of me. I could tell the sound was coming from the female toilets, though. I gripped the handle and opened the door a tiny little crack. The noise was now very clear and had me not scared but confused. I yelled, "Who is in there?" The noise quickly stopped. I paused for a moment, listening hard through the tiny crack of the door, and I swear to God I could hear breathing, low male breathing. I shut the door, still gripping the handle tightly, and flicked on my radio. "This is 1-3. I need help in the food court bathrooms. I think someone's here." There was no response. This was really strange, and it put me further on edge. Policy was to always answer the radio, and now I was truly becoming quite alarmed. "This is 1-3. Does anyone copy?" Still no response. I can remember whispering to myself, "What the actual fuck?" I again opened the door a tiny crack. "Listen, mate," I said, sounding as intimidating as possible. "If you don't come out with your hands up, you're going to end up eating your teeth tonight. Do you want that?" I sat there at the door, quite honestly terrified at this point. This whole situation made no sense at all. Why would someone be in the female bathrooms? What was the metal noise? What the fuck is even happening? I very slowly opened the door and scanned my flashlight slowly across the room. All the cubicles were open, but other than that, the room was totally empty. I was totally terrified by now. I was definitely losing it. I walked into the center of the bathroom, closing the door behind me, scared to the core. I let out a faint, "This is some horror movie shit, come out," when I heard the long, whining squeak of the door behind me. I spun around, basically crying at this point, and shone my flashlight on a massive man, at least a head taller than me, or so it seemed in my state at the time. He was Caucasian and at least in his 40s, with matte gray hair all over his forehead. He was mid-opening the door but stopped dead still in the middle of his action. He just looked at me, smiling this guilty smile like a kid would make when he gets caught stealing biscuits or some shit like that. I'm not going to lie, I was so scared I froze. He lifted his finger up to his mouth, shh, before swinging the door open all the way and sprinting out with what looked like some type of small metal box in his hand. Turns out he was just behind the toilet door when I was opening it, and I totally missed him. I was so close to him and didn't even notice him. He could have killed me if he had a knife or something, and that thought still haunts me to this day. Later that night, my radio miraculously started working again, and I told my coworkers about my story. They collectively went pale when I told them what happened. They all had similar stories, but none were as much of a close shave as mine. I worked the night shift for another week after that before I quit. I'm not sticking around in a job like that.